It's a buddy comedy from 1987, written and directed by John Hughes, starring Steve Martin and John Candy as the main protagonists. Steve Martin's character Neil Page is just a businessman trying to get home to Chicago for his family's Thanksgiving dinner. And after his flight gets cancelled, he ends up traveling across country with Del Griffith, John Candy, using every form of travel, including, you guessed it, planes, trains, and automobiles. And with that out of the way, let's just get into it. We start off with the introduction of Neil Page, who was just trying to catch a flight back to Chicago. Running late for this flight, he races Kevin Bacon on the street for a cab and loses by tripping on a big wooden chest in the middle of the street. He tries bribing someone who already got a cab, but before he can get in it, it is stolen by someone else. He chases it down and yells through the window at this person. This is the inciting incident, because as we'll soon find out, the man in the cab was Del Griffith, the other main character of this movie. He gets to the airport finally, and he finds that his flight is delayed. He sits across from Del, they recognize each other, and Del tries to apologize after realizing that he did steal his cab. On the plane, they're sat next to each other. This plane does not land in Chicago. It lands in Wichita. Neil is out of options, because instead of calling for a motel, he called his family. Del offers him a hotel room, but Neil refuses, still having hope that the flight won't get canceled officially. The flight gets canceled officially, and out of options, Neil accepts Del's help. In the classic hero's journey, this is the refusal of the call followed by the acceptance of it. This is also the first plot point, which marks the end of the first act. Our main hero has now passed the threshold into the unknown world. At this motel, Neil and Del are forced to share a room, and they find out it only has one bed. This results in a lot of tension, and while Neil is getting less and less patient with Del, he snaps.
I mean, didn't you notice on the plane when you started talking, eventually I started reading the vomit bag? Didn't that give you some sort of clue, like, hey, maybe this guy's not enjoying it?
Feeling bad, Neil gets back into bed, and they sleep. In the morning at breakfast, they realize they were robbed in the night. This leads to Del having the idea of getting to Chicago by train instead. Del calls a friend from the railroad, and this friend sends his son to pick them up. After riding in the back of a truck in the freezing cold, both say their goodbyes and get on the train. The train breaks down, and they have to walk for miles back to the station. After getting there, they decide to travel by bus to the nearest city. They get lunch in this city and have a nice conversation that reveals a lot about our main duo.
I've been home in years.
Neil decides that he should travel alone. He gets a rental car, and when he gets to the lot where it's supposed to be, it isn't there. He's forced to walk down the freeway and down a runway to get back to Marathon. After getting in a tussle on the sidewalk, our fated duo meet again, and with no escape in sight, they resume their journey together. I mark this as the midpoint of the film, happening almost exactly halfway through. Our characters are forced once again to travel together, and it is also the only way for both characters to achieve their goal. Now we drive. On this highway of hell, our brave hero find themselves close to death not once but twice. Neither of these are the climax, by the way. The climax comes when the car that was rented catches on fire. This is where they both just laugh at how outlandish this trip has been, and Del reveals that Neil's credit card accidentally found its way into his wallet. They're not laughing now. In anger, Neil demands it back, and Del had already returned it to his wallet, which is currently burning behind them. Neil punches Del in the stomach, and a wedge is created between them. I believe this to be the climax of the film. It is the height of the action, as well as our characters' emotional states. Neil basically has a mental break when he starts to hysterically laugh at the situation. This is plot point number 2, and it leads us into the final act of the film. We've now entered the denouement, the descending action. Our characters put out the fire, and they drive this half-melted death trap to the nearest motel. Neil is forced to pay for his room with spare cash and his watch, and Del, on the other hand...
I have $2 and a Casio.
Later, after not getting a room, Del is sitting in the cold where he reveals through talking to himself that his one goal was to make a friend and put an end to his loneliness. Neil sees Del sitting out in the cold and decides he needs to let him in. This leads to them finally bonding like friends. They raid the minibar and eat all the snacks while talking about their families. The next morning, they get pulled over and the car is impounded for obvious reasons. and they end up having to hitch a ride in the back of a dairy truck for 3 hours until they finally arrive in Chicago. They say their goodbyes at the train station, and Neil admits that this trip has probably made him a better person in some ways. Del shares the same sentiment. They part ways, and on the train ride back to his house, Neil thinks about Thanksgiving dinner and how good the turkey will be. Then he starts thinking back on the trip. He starts to piece together certain details about Del. He goes back to the station and he finds Del sitting there.
I don't have a home. Marie's been dead for 8 years.
Neil brings Del to the Thanksgiving dinner, introduces him to his family, and the both characters achieve their objectives. Our hero has returned to the ordinary world, a changed person, and the movie concludes there. Thank you for watching my breakdown, and I hope it wasn't too boring. Peace.